Hello, I'm Dan Ginter, and this is David Bill. We're members of the Coweta Falls chapter, Georgia Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. In order to be a member of the Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, we have to be able to trace our family lineage all the way back to someone who participated during the American Revolution. Our mission is,
with the Coweta Falls chapter, our mission is the Sons of the American Revolution is a leading male-aligned society that perpetuates the ideals of the war for independence as a historical, educational, patriotic, and a nonprofit corporation. We seek to maintain and expand the meaning of patriotism, respect for our national symbols, the value of American citizenship, and the unifying force of e pluribus unum that was created from the people of many nations, one nation and one people.
I'd like to thank the Muskogee County School District and especially Gentian Elementary for allowing us to film this today. Our traveling trunk is a program that we go from school to school, but with the coronavirus epidemic, we just can't get into the schools to talk with the students. So we figured that if we filmed this, then each teacher could have the students pull this up and look at it when they want. Our goal is to go with the fourth grade standards of the state on the American Revolution. Now, first of all, these weapons that we have here are non-firing. We have permission to bring them into the school, but they are non-firing. They look like, they act like, but they're non-firing. Now, I want to warn the students, do not bring anything that looks like a weapon or is a weapon to the school, because as you all know, that's illegal and you will be taken out of the school in handcuffs by the police. Now, to start with, we want to talk about why people came over to this country. If you look at the map up here, you can see that the colonies are pretty much set there. Up in the north, we have what we call the New England colonies. Down around New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, you start having the middle colonies. And then down below that, Virginia, all the way down to Georgia, you have the southern plantation colonies. One of the other areas that is talked about in the standards is called the frontier. That's beyond all the colored states there that you see, and that's a frontier where people go to seek adventure or to seek getting away from the police, the law. Now, life up in the New England colonies is pretty rugged. The ground is it's not good soil. Crops are not good for growing. The things that they do have are large trees. They have the trees that make masts for ships. They make ships. They make ropes. They fish a lot. And the houses primarily are made out of wood. Some of them do not have wooden floors. Children were not required to go to school because they wanted to be an apprentice to learn how to make ships and so forth. Now, if you come down to the middle colonies, you had three main rivers that ran north and south. Now, this was important because they would put their crops on there. They had a lot of fertile land to grow crops. And they put them on these ships and they'd move them from north to south, and it was good for commerce. They also had a lot of ports there. They had New York, they had Philadelphia, and Boston. When people would come over, they would go into these ports and they would stay because they said, hey, this looks like Europe. I traveled 3 to 6 months on a ship to get over across the ocean to get here, and now I've got a place over here. So they stayed, and when they stayed, these little communities became bigger and bigger and bigger. And with those big communities came a lot of problems. So they had to figure out how to handle. They had all the smiths there, the coppersmiths, the silversmiths, coppersmiths. They had all the smiths there, blacksmiths. And then they had people who did doctors, they were lawyers, they were teachers. You had everything. Houses were made out of wood or brick. A lot of them were brick. They had wooden floors. They had nice furniture, nice ornaments, and life was good. It was just like being back over in Europe. Then you come down to the southern colonies, and you had Charleston and Savannah as the main ports. Here you had your large plantations. They had some fertile land, and they started growing tobacco. Primary crop was indigo, to make indigo ink. With these large plantations, they had to have somebody maintain them. And as the land got bigger, the children were not working, they were going to school and getting an education, then that's when they needed extra help. That's when about over 400,000 slaves were brought in at that time. As we were living over here and maintaining the French, who the British did not like, and they fought them for years, were up in the north. And they started moving down and building forts down in Pennsylvania. They take over our fishing rights. They started getting the Native Americans to fight against us, causing a problem. So the colonists started complaining to the British people in charge. Well, all of a sudden they said, in 1754, let's send a convoy to talk to them, an ambassador, to tell them that they need to stop moving into our territory. They sent a young lieutenant colonel who was a Virginia militiaman. His name was George Washington. He had very little experience in the military, and he was accompanied by a group of Indians that were friendly to the colonials and a few of his men. They went and they got up there and they camped. The Indian chief by the name of Half King, he had a long name, but they called him Half King. He went ahead and he came back and he told George Washington that there was a group of French up there that were setting up an ambush. So George Washington said, what do we do? And he said, we need to ambush them. So they went ahead and they moved forward and they got up on top of this ridge looking down into this glen where the French were camped, and they attacked them. Well, once they got down there, they found out that they weren't there to attack them. One person got loose and went back to the fort and told the commander. The commander's brother was one of those who got killed. So he got his group up. He started coming after George Washington and his men, and they chased him. George Washington and his men built this hasty fortification called Fort Necessity, and that's in your book, Fort Necessity. And they got attacked, and so finally George Washington surrendered. He promised never to come back into that territory again. And when he went back, he wrote up a report that made it look like he was the one who repelled the French, and it was a glowing report. They all liked it. That, along with the fishing rights, the moving down, the post moving down into their territory, the Indians rioting against them, was probably the cause of the French and Indian War. George Washington wanted to be a British officer. He asked them. They said no. So he got out and then he went back to Virginia and started farming. As things went on, we finally won the French and Indian War, which lasted, or another term is the 7 Years' War. Now, in that war, there were some things that came out. One day, there were a couple of British officers up on top of a hill, and they were looking down at the battle taking place. And they saw the guys that we had called the militiamen. They were ragtags, they were dirty, they were uniforms torn, and they started laughing. And they said, look at those doodles. They called us Yankees. They called us Yankees. They said, look at those Yankee Doodles. There was a song going around, and they took the tune from that song, and they put it into Yankee Doodle went to town, riding on a pony, and he stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Now, you heard that song. You heard that song. But now when you go back and look at it, what does macaroni mean? Macaroni, back in the day, young British men would dress in these fancy clothes and wear these big wigs and put these fake moles on their cheek to look good. This was what we would call being in style. They called that macaroni. So they thought that all we had to do in our ragtag outfits was ride into town, put a feather in our hat, and we were in style. So like a bully, they said that to us. But like what we ought to do if a bully says something mean to us, is said, okay, and we started singing the song, and that became our fight song. We even made up a lot of verses on it. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, and we loved it. Well, the British were upset because we liked it, and they couldn't get one on us. So that was one of the things that came out of the French and Indian War. And then also, after the war, the British were there. There was lots of troops here in the continent. And the king says, I've been fighting wars all over. I need some money. So he sends out his people and says, get the money from the colonials. Tax them. Well, we got taxed, and we figured we were getting taxed for the support and the protection, but the taxes became intolerable. And there we call them the Intolerable Taxes. And so the Sugar Act and these other acts, the Paper Act, everything, the Tea Act. Well, you know what we did? We got upset. Sam Adams and Paul Revere and Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, all of these guys were part of what we call the Sons of Liberty. They had a lot more people in there that I haven't named, but they got together and they started to make a riot. One night they dressed up like Mohawk Indians, took their shirts off, put some paint on, put some feathers up around their head, and they went into the ships that were parked out in the bay. These ships were carrying tea, barrels of tea, and the king figured he was going to make a lot of money on that. Well, these guys went in and turned all of those tea into the water, and that was called the Boston Tea Party. We heard about that. The first African American that was killed during our cause was in Boston. His name was Crispus Attucks. He was involved in a little altercation with some British soldiers, and as it grew, the British soldiers fired, and he was the first one killed, along with a couple of other men. But Crispus Attucks, his mother was a Native American, and his father was an African American, or an African slave. So he was our first African American that died. As we go along, the battles were few and far between. We went to Lexington and Concord, and I've walked those areas out there, and it's just amazing what happened. Now, Lexington, there was like 700 British soldiers here, and there were 60 to 70 militia, old men, young men, and younger men standing there to front the British soldiers. They told them to lay down their weapons, and they said no, and it's kept up. And finally, somebody fired. We don't know who fired, but all of a sudden, they unleashed 700 rounds coming at them, and these men fell. And obviously, those that were standing, could stand, took off and they ran to Concord. After the British fixed bayonets and come charging at them across the field. So that was Lexington. They went to Concord, and there was a bridge there, the North Bridge. They set up an ambush, and they repelled the British soldiers. And all the way back, they did the Native American tactics. They would hide behind trees and walls, and they would shoot and run, and they would start picking off the British soldiers, and they called that a victory. Well, that one shot that was heard across the field in Lexington was not heard. They called it the shot heard around the world. Obviously, you couldn't hear it, but the word traveled of what happened, and then other countries started listening to it and wondering, here's the British picking on these poor little people over here. So that battle took place, and then other battles went forward, the Battle of Saratoga, and the other ones, and finally, we won. We pinned in Cornwallis, who was the general at that time. He wanted to surrender, but he didn't want to come and do it himself. He had a younger officer go and present his sword to George Washington and said that he surrendered, while he still stayed back. Well, after the war, we figured that was the end of it. That was the end of it, but it wasn't. Just imagine trying to start a country, making laws and rules. All that time that we were fighting the British, we were under the Articles of Confederation. We've had 8 presidents before George Washington became president. 8 presidents. And then the Articles of Confederation were made into our Constitution. It was signed, and George Washington was our first president under the Constitution. The day that he took his oath of office, he had one tooth in his head that belonged to him. All through his life, he had nine diseases that plagued him, but he still carried on. He was a miraculous man. And with that one tooth, he went ahead. And if you ever see him in a picture on a dollar bill or a painting, he's always got his lips kind of pursed, and it looks like he's got something in his mouth. Well, he does. This is what he had in his mouth. This is an appliance that contained his one tooth, his porcelain teeth. He had teeth from cadavers, but no wooden teeth. And so this is what he had in his mouth, and so it was hard to talk. Okay, so after the war, people started moving into these areas, and they started settling down, and they had to build a house. And once you move into woods, just imagine what you see around you now is all leveled out. We've had big vehicles come in and knock the trees down. There they had little hatchets and axes, and they had to chop this down. Back-breaking work. And once they got it cleared out, they had to remove the stumps, and then they had to plow it, and then they had to sow it. And so it was just a lot of work. And a lot of work, they needed children. And children were used to work back in the day. My mom was one of 10 children. And I asked her about that. And she said, oh yeah, my mom was doing her job, and all the other kids around there, they had jobs around the house and outside, so they needed children. Now, if you moved into an area, you have to cut the trees down. And everything in the environment was used to make a living. For example, this wooden bucket over here was made out of wood with a leather band going around it to hold it together. The buckets were carried, and they would go down and they would get water in them. They would use gourds, grow gourds, cut it out, and so they could dip into there and have a dipping gourd. This is a canteen. Now this is a canteen. They would put, now what do you think they drank a lot? You think they drank water? No, they drank water. It was contaminated. They would probably get sick and die. They drank cider, they drank beer, and if they were lucky, they would drink wine, but wine was very expensive to get. So this canteen that he had with the gourds was used. They put that in the haversack and take it out to the fields and work. Well, down the road, there was a guy who considered himself to be a blacksmith and a little bit of an entrepreneur. So instead of the gourds, he took some tin, and he would make us a little dipper cup. And he would put that on there and hammer it down, and so it wouldn't break. It wouldn't break. He also made this other canteen out of wood. Now with this canteen, you can see that here, that's wood, And what happens is it would have a tendency to leak. And what in our environment do we have that's going to stop things from leaking? It's sticky. It's called pine sap. So they would put pine sap around that to stop the leak. But after a period of time, this wood would get soggy and they would have to go and start it all over again. And it gets heavy. So what he did then was he made this. This is a can. It's called a kidney canteen. As you see, on one side it's round, on the other side it fits right along your side, and it's called a kidney canteen. Right there. It makes it easy to carry. Let's imagine that we came over and we came into Savannah. And I've got my wife and my 2 or 3 kids with me, and we're going to go from Savannah west. We want to get away from all this government stuff. We are kind of wild people. So before I left, I got me a book on some medicine, bought a few things, bought me an old cow, and I linked up with Mr. Bill here. Mr. Bill, he bought him some sheep, and another guy over here got some rabbits and got some chickens. And we said, we're taking our families west. So we get out there and we finally say, this is where I'm going to stay. We cut down the trees and we help each other. It's a community type thing. He helps me, I help him. We build my house. My house is made out of wood, but there's no wooden floor in there. It's dirt. We may have a table because that was easy to make. No chairs at the present time. The most important thing in the house was the fireplace. We had some windows, we had some little corners where the kids would sleep. I may have had a place over upstairs to make a little shelf up there, a little loft, and that's where we would sleep. But it was pretty rustic. We had a well out front and where we would get some water out of the ground. Now I said we didn't drink the water, but we ate soup. Now, why did I not get sick eating soup? Well, it's because, I know you're smart over there, it's because the water boiled to 212 degrees. And so we figured that if we boiled the water before we drank it, then that way we would be safe to go. So everything in our environment we are going to use. I had the cow produces milk and butter. He had the sheep. He had the rabbits, he had the chickens, and I wanted some eggs, he wanted some milk, and so we traded. And this is called the B word, barter. Barter. We would barter, and no money is exchanged. We helped each other out. Well, one day that old cow died. And it had a crazy horn, and it had a regular horn. Well, with this horn, my wife said, what are you going to do with that? And I said, what do you say? She said, what are you going to do with that? I cut a little tip off and I said, what did you say? And it's like being on the playground where you're on one side and you go, what are you doing over there? And they go, nothing, what are you doing? So we took this horn and I polished it up and I made a powder horn out of it. Cut a hole in the top, plugged it up, put my powder in there, and my gunpowder stayed dry. This was a great thing. She said, what else are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to make you a spoon. Made a spoon out of this horn. She said, what else are you going to do? I said, I'm going to make you a comb. She said, what's that for? And I said, honey, your hair is looking a little ratty. Well, she drawed off and hit me and knocked me out. Now I woke up the next day and I saw her over there and she had this comb and she was going through her hair and pretty soon it was all smoothed out and looking good and she said, thank you, thank you. So got a comb out of it. We killed a deer and you all you guys know that this was a buck, a male deer. Well, everything on the deer we're going to use. The antler would tie us a stick onto it and then we could drag it and make some holes, rows, One kid could go through and put some seeds in there. Another kid can go and put water over top. And that way we can grow our crops. One of the students told me, he said, you can make a slingshot out of that. And I said, yeah, you could. Or else you could just come up and jab somebody like that in self-defense. So the animal gave us a lot of help. The deerskin, this is only part of a deerskin. We took this, and a Native American gave me this flint knife. He said, just put you a stick on the end of it and you got you a knife. I said, no, I'd rather use it as a scraper. And if you've ever watched your mom with chicken and fat and other meat, there's some fat on the inside. So I take this and I scrape it all off and put it in that bucket. Get it all scraped off. Then I take it and I wad it up and I put it in water and move it all around, dry it out. And then what I do is build a little fire with some smoke. Hold on, that is. And we would hold it over the fire. You know, we would get it up there. As the smoke comes up, it would go into these pores and cause it to be dark. And that's what we call buckskin. And then we can make clothes out of it. My wife says, well, what do you want? And I said, well, when a deer runs through the woods, it doesn't get any burrs on it. So what I want is I want some chaps that goes around here like this to block the burrs from coming. She said, well, I got to poke holes in it. I said, don't worry. The blacksmith has made some scissors. One big wire that comes up here and goes up. Another wire goes like that, and you put a rivet in the middle, and these are scissors. So what he will do is poke holes in this, or what she does, poke holes in it. And she said, what kind of thread do you think we would use? We would not use, we don't go down to McDonald's or Walmart or anything. We get some thread that is made out of sinew. Sinew. Now what is sinew? If you reach in the back of your leg and you feel that tendon that goes from here down to here, that is a tendon. I cut that off the deer, put it on a rock, and beat it. And it flares out. And when it flares out, you have this. You have all of these flaring out, you tie it in a knot. This is so tight or so strong that you cannot break it. You have to cut it with a knife. So she would use this to sew our garments. This is one of the items that would go in our haversack when we went out. Everything in our environment we use, we made cups out of tree limbs. Just cut them off, shave them down, cut them out. Made little bowls out of it. Made bigger bowls out of it. Wooden spoons. Children's spoons. And then the blacksmith made us one of these little plates. And what would happen is you take your pine straw, tie it, hit it at a knot here with the string, and after you get through eating, the children would take it, brush it off, take it outside, put some sand on it, dip it in the water, hang it up, and you're good to go. Now, the blacksmith would also make some of these cast iron utensils. The wooden ones would get burned up or broken, so he made these for us. Pretty neat. He made a fork. Most of the time we would use a spoon or a knife. So he came out with this fork. He just took a wire and twisted it, come down, and it's pretty sharp on the end. That way you could fork your meat or whatever you wanted to fork, put it on your plate. We had a smokehouse to keep our animals, so he would make us a key and lock to put on there to help lock it, because we did have people try to break in and steal our food. Now, you all know who made these. This was made by Benjamin Franklin. So bifocals, that help you to see up close. See up close. Now let's talk about the clothing that they wore back there in the outback. Look at Mr. Bill here. He had some pants that were made out of either leather or flannel or whatever they could get. They had this. This is called a hunter's frock. A hunter's frock, and he would wear that when he went hunting. He'd wear a tricorn hat. For me, I'm dressed as if George Washington, if I was on his staff. George Washington liked this blue with a buff, lots of buttons. They love buttons for some reason. They got the vest, got the little scarf here, got the breeches, and then the socks, and then they would have shoes with buckles, or they would wear riding boots. George Washington wanted his men to all look like this, and they said, George, we just don't have enough material to do that. So he said, well, go the way you want. Well, the Green Mountain Boys wore green outfits. Some of them wore blue with a red facing. They would wear blue with a white facing. They would wear knickers. They would wear long pants. They wore everything, but the only thing he said don't wear is red. If you wore red, then we would think you were part of the British Army and you may get shot. The thing that he really loved was this outfit right here, because when you look at a hunter and they're all lined up on the battlefield, British soldiers said it was a fear in them that they had, because the hunters are good at what? Shooting. And so when they saw them, they were fearful. So that was one of the outfits that they wore. Now the children would wear the breeches and the socks, and they may wear one of these waistcoats. They would wear a tricorn hat. They would wear a tricorn hat, which is a little bit different than what we have. If they were going out, they would wear a fancy hat. And if they worked in the field, they would wear one of these straw hats to keep the sun off them. Now females, when they worked in the house, they had to keep their hair up. So they would wear a mop hat. Now Mr. Bill is being my model here. They would wear a mop hat to keep their hair up so it wouldn't get into the fire or into the food. So that was one of the things they would do. Since a lot of these outfits didn't have pockets, they looked like they had pockets, they had to wear what we call a haversack. Now this haversack is what we call now a book bag or a purse, a mail purse. And the boys would put everything that they had in this haversack. Now girls would have, they would have a dress, a skirt that would come up to here, would wear sleeve shirts. And they'd have a skirt to come on, and in the skirt there's two slits in the side. Underneath, they would take these pockets. These are pockets. And they would put them on underneath their skirt. And they would reach in there, and in these pockets they would carry, their scissors, they carry whatever. They could stick their hands in there and go down deep. And this was what the women had, since there were no pockets in the thing. Okay, now, life out there, you had to stay clean and hygiene. And so what we would do, you remember I scraped all of that fat off? We would get this pot of water boiling. We would put that fat in there, we'd reach down and grab some ashes and throw those ashes in and stir them up and then lay it out. And then as it got hard, we cut it into little bars like this. This is called Lye Soap. It doesn't smell, and they would go out and they would wash with the Lye Soap. If they got sick, remember I said I bought a book on medicine, but I didn't have everything. Where we learned how to take care of things was our Native American friends that we met. We'd go over and say, oh, I got a stomachache, it's hurting. And they would mix up some herbs in this pestle, mix it up, we would take it, and then later on we would feel better. So we learned a lot of our medicine from our Native American friends. In our house, we said that the most important thing was the fireplace. And the fireplace allowed us to have light, it allowed us to cook our food, and it gave us heat. Now, in order to have the fireplace, we have to build a fire. To build a fire, we have to have a piece of flint, a piece of metal, and then we'd have some kindling, like a bird's nest, as you see in the picture. Now that we know how to start the fire, we got to have light in the house. So what we do is we get beeswax, get that from the bee's nest, and we bring it in and we melt it, we make blocks out of it. And then when it's time to pour it into the candle holder, which you see there, it's got 4, we will melt it, pour it into the candle holder. There's a wick that goes inside and it's tied to a string to keep it straight. And then once it's finished, we can pour the candles out and we can put them in our candle holders. The problem is the wind blows the candles off, it shuts off the light. So we had the blacksmith make us a lantern. And that lantern is just rolled tin, and it's punctured from the inside. The holes are put in from the inside so that the wind cannot come in from the outside. And there's some holes at the top that are round, which allows the air to get to it. It keeps the candle burning. And you can shut the door, and when you walk around, it provides us a light, just like a lantern would today. If you're wondering about all that fat that we scraped off in the bucket, what we do for that, because beeswax is hard to get, and we don't want to take it away from the bees all the time. So we take that fat and we put that in a boiling water in a big pot, and then we take some ashes from the fire and throw that in there, and we melt that down, and then we pour it out. And then we do the same thing like we do with the candle. This is called tallow. And the tallow we want to put out a dimmer light with some smoke, but it's used quite a bit instead of the beeswax. They would use slate with chalk to write on. Of course, this is the Jensen Chargers here that we are in their media center. They would use slate to write on. They would have mugs. This is a brick of tea. There's 2, 4, 6, 8 little blocks there. It all has the seal on it, where I paid the tax. And what we would do is we'd take this with a, you want to hold this? We'd hold the strainer. We would knock off some tea into the strainer. We'd take hot water, pour that in there. We'd let it sit. Pull the strainer out, take a drink. Is it bitter? Bitter. So what we have is sugar, a cone of sugar. It's got a seal on it that shows that we pay for it. We would scrape some of the sugar off into the cup. He would drink it, and it tastes much better, right? Okay, much better. Mugs. I had mugs that had glass at the bottom. And this was probably because before the American Revolution, the British would go into pubs and they would put a coin in the bottom and they would hand it to men and say, hey, would you want a mug of ale? And if you drank that mug of ale and at the bottom there was a coin, he's now paid you to be in the Navy. And that was bad. So what they did, they came out with some glass. So when he says, you want a mug of ale, you look underneath and go, no, thank you, don't want it, don't want it. So they worked that out. A lot of these little clay pipes were found around excavation sites. George Washington had some that had some of his initials on it, his family, but it was a reed. And you couldn't put very much tobacco in there, and this was kind of like a social thing. A guy would go into a pub, and a pub stands for public house, where people exchanged ideas and so forth and sit around and talk, a public house. So he'd go into the pub, and he'd take one of these pipes off the wall, he'd cut off the top, put his tobacco in there, light it, and sit around and look cool. Well, when he's finished, he'd empty it, he'd hang it back up to the next guy. Well, when I got to it, it was down to here, and if I tried that, it'd burn my nose hairs out. So what I had to do was pull this out and put a new reed in there, and then it would start all over. These clay pipes were used over and over and over, and you find them around excavation sites. Now, Indigo Ink was one of the cash crops down here in the South. And what you would do is you'd get you a chicken feather or a crow feather, and you would sharpen it at the end, put the ink in there, dip it in there, and then you would write your letter. Now, Indigo ink was also used on these playing cards. Now, Mr. Bill, I want you to tell me, what card is this? Two what?
Hearts.
He says 2 of hearts. Now, I don't know anybody out there that can see a 2 on there. Anybody see a 2? You see a 2? Now, how did you know it was a 2?
It was 2 hearts.
Well, how did you know? How did you know it was 2? Because when you were little, this is how you were taught to count. They would say, this is 1, this is 2. This is 3, this is 4, this is 5, this is 6, this is 7. And when you messed up, they'd slap you on the head and say, go back and try it again. So you learned how to count by counting the things that were on here. And it was made out of indigo ink. Now, our money that we had continental dollars. This is a continental dollar. It's 1 shilling and 4 pence. Now, it's printed on both sides, but as you put it in your pocket and you work all day, it eventually turns into something that looks like this. You can't even read it. So what we had to do was we went to the Spanish coins. Spanish coins. We would have this coin, and you could take it, and it would not fade. So when you went to go buy something, you come up and say, how much is that? And you say, 50 cents. And you go, oh. So you break it in half, then you come up and you give him 50 cents. Then you take that 50 cents over and say, how much is that? They say, well, that's a quarter. Oh, okay. Break that in half, and you come up with a quarter. This is a quarter. It's a little tiny thing. So then you go over and say, how much is that candy? And they say, well, that's half of a quarter. You go, huh, what's half of a quarter? Does anybody know what half of 25 is? 12 and a half cents, that's right, 12 and a half cents. So you break that, and then you come up, and this is 12 and a half cents. This is called a bit. Now, you've heard that song, 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits, $1. Nobody knew what a bit was. A bit is 12 and a half cents. And when you put 2 of these together, you have 25 cents. And then when you put 4 of them together, you have 50 cents. 6 bits is 75, and then 8 bits is $1. So that's that song that you heard, 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits, $1. All 4 gentians stand up and holler. All right, so we had that. Okay, now I want to go back to the flag here. We missed a flag. One of the myths that we have is that our very first flag was made by, and you know who this is, Mr. Bill. Who made this flag?
Betsy Ross.
Betsy Ross. Betsy Ross. This is a beautiful flag. 13 stars, all in a circle. Nobody's first and nobody's last. The myth is that one day George Washington and members of the Continental Congress came to her and said, Miss Ross, you're a seamstress, we'd like you to make us a flag. 13 stars on a blue background, 13 stripes alternating red and white. She says, okay. And they said, we want 6 points on the stars. And Betsy said, well, George, I can't do 6, I'll do 5. They said, okay. Well, this myth got publicized 100 years later during the centennial. Her great-grandkids heard about the story, and they had it published, they put it out. It's even in our books. When you look at our history books, you'll see the Betsy Ross flag. It's a beautiful flag, but it was a battle flag. It was not our very first flag of our country. So let me show you the very first flag of our country. This is called the Francis Hopkinson flag. Francis Hopkinson was a guy that made flags for the Navy. He was contracted by the Continental Congress. Members of Continental Congress and George Washington gave him the idea. They wanted 13 stars, 6 points on a blue background and alternating red and white thing. He says, okay. So he's got 6 points on these stars. There's 13 of them. But do we talk about Francis Hopkinson in our books? No, Betsy Ross' story is a lot better. And so we promote that in our history books as she made the first flag. She did not. Francis Hopkinson did. So that's a myth. All right, back to the Indigo Ink. Now we said we used Indigo Ink. There was a tax on paper. So we would take this paper, and there was a tax on envelopes. So I would take this paper and I would dip down into the ink and I'd write, my dearest Sarah, would you please meet me under the big oak tree at high noon on Saturday? Sincerely yours, Danny. Well, I had to wait till it dried. And when it dried, I folded it. I folded it up like this, and then I shut it down. Well, to keep my little brother David from looking in it, I have to put a seal on it. So I would get my sealing wax, I'd heat it up, I would drop it onto the envelope, take my seal, stamp it, and now it's sealed. And all it needed to be is delivered. And I'd have David take it over to Sarah. So as that song goes, signed, sealed, and delivered. Y'all, if you don't know that, ask your teachers. They know how that song goes. Signed, sealed, and delivered. Another thing that we would have is this is called a decoder roll here. And what I would do is if I wanted to send a message to Mr. Bill over there, I would put my message, I would roll these discs like that until I got the message going across that I wanted. And then I would take a piece of paper and a pen, ink, and I would write DTTYAIVEHMAR. And if anybody got stopped by the British and said, "What is this?" you can say, "I'm practicing my writing." Well, Mr. Bill would get the message. He would go to his decoder roll, and he would put that in, and he would keep flipping, and the meeting is going to be taken at, you can't read it, but it says Gentian. Gentian right across there. You would put your message in, and he would get it, and it would be so concealed, nobody would know. So that's the decoder bill. Now, when we met on Saturday at our little pub, and we would sell things and buy things and trade, and music was going on, and people were exchanging ideas, and we would play music. And this is we would play this, and you can't make a tune out of it. We would beat on the floor, on the drums, anything. We would beat on, we would sing, clap our hands, and everybody would have a good time, because after working 6 days out in the field, we needed some time to relax and carry on. Now, I had a song, I like to play this jaw harp. And with this jaw harp, it's just what the blacksmith made a big old wire right there, and one going through the center, and you thumb it. Now, this song here, whoop. There it is. And that song was
Yankee Doodle.
Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle. You win. You win. So the Yankee Doodle. Toys. Kids love toys. They would take wooden things and they would make cutlasses out of them and knives out of them. They said, "I'm going to kill me a bear. I want to fight me a pirate." They would do all these things. The boys loved activity. They loved activity. Another thing was a flute. They would play the flute. I can't play it. Been about 6 years I've been carrying that thing around. Can't play it. Girls, they loved to play with corn shuck husk dolls here. They would play with this. You'd have the papa, the mama, the brother, and the little sister here. And they would play it. They would play house because they would mimic what mom would do. And when mom would do it, they're going to grow up and they're going to be a mom. The boys, again, playing war, playing fight and all this. They had the little pewter men. They would play army. They had a game called Skittles. It's about like our bowling. You would take a ball and you would bowl it into this and try to knock these pins down. I can't knock them down. They would knock them down. They had hoops that they would roll and go from one end to the other, rolling the hoops. They played London Bridge. They played tag. They played a lot of games that we do now, or that we did, and what you're doing now. They played a lot of those games. They just handed down from generation to generation. They had tops. They loved tops. These tops right here, you spin them. And then he came out with one here that you just pull, and it goes off, goes crazy. This is called the Jacob's Ladder. They would sit for hours and try to figure out how this thing worked. And all I did was just move my hand here, move my hand, and the ribbons moved down. So we figured that out. The other game they had is called the cup and ball. The cup and ball. They would have a ball on the end of the string. They would have this, hold on now. They would have this, and the object was to flip it in, and boys would play this as a hand and eye coordination. Hand and eye coordination. So we would do this, and keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And a lot of times you had a tooth knocked out, a dent in the head,
Black eye.
a black eye. You'd have all kinds. But they would play with this. You got it. Good, good. All right. Now, let's go on to the weapons. The weapons that were back in the day, they had pistols and they had muskets. And a lot of times they'd carry hatchets and knives and spears and anything that was going to hurt the other person. Well, in this weapon, it's called the lock, you got the stock, and you got the barrel. And in this lock, you have a pan that you put some gunpowder in, and there's a hole that goes into the barrel. You put this striker down. This is flint. And remember what I said about flint hitting metal, it's going to cause a spark. And that spark is going to light the powder that's there. Well, you finish with this. You go ahead and you pour some powder down in here. You take the pistol ball, you put it in with wadding, and you ram it down. And then if you went to fire, let's say at an animal running, you would follow it, you would bam, then it would go off. It does not shoot it out immediately because the powder has to be ignited. It has to ignite the powder here, and then it's got to send the projectile out. So we have the lock, the stock, and the barrel. Before the American Revolution, we had these muskets. You want to hold this like this? This is called the Brown Bess. The British made it. It was named after English Queen Elizabeth. This was blonde in color, and as it got out into the weather, it all turned dark. Again, you have your lock, you have your stock, and then you have this long barrel. We were given those before the French and Indian War to hunt with, protect us against marauding Indians and other people. They gave it to us during the French and Indian War so we could use it. And then after the French and Indian War, they started taking them back. And they would put them in warehouses and armories. And so in order for us to have a revolution, we had to have weapons. So we would break into these armories and steal these weapons and use them for ourselves. Now there's smoothbore, which means this right here does not have any rifling. As the musket ball comes out, it comes out and it's projected, and then after a while the wind gets it and it's like throwing a knuckleball. It kind of floats through the air. So if you're shooting at something over here, you may hit something over there. And that's a lot bigger than the pistol ball. A lot bigger than the pistol ball. Now during the American Revolution, we needed more weapons. So Benjamin Franklin was our ambassador. He went to France. Now who did we fight first? We were fighting the French. Well, the French heard that we fought the British and we beat them in the Battle of Saratoga. And they said, oh, you guys got something there. We don't like the British, so we're going to help you. What do you need? And Benjamin Franklin said, we need uniforms, we need food, we need money, we need soldiers, we need just weapons, anything you can give us. So they made us this weapon here in a town called Charleville, France. Same thing, lock, stock, and the barrel. And as you see, it's a little shorter, but is it really? Once you put the muzzles up there, the lock and the barrel are the same. It's the stock that's different. The stock is different. This is lighter. This is lighter. On the bottom, they have this, and this is what they used, for enclosed fighting. They would use anything they had. The other thing that they put on the weapon is this bayonet. Now, I'm going to stand back and I'm going to show you how far this bayonet can reach toward Mr. Bill. Okay? Go ahead, move back some because I can't. Okay, now come up. If I came up, I could actually go this far and stay away from him. Stay away. So this bayonet helped us keep a distance on our enemy. It was a dangerous weapon because it had 3 sides, 1, 2, and 3. As it goes in and comes out, instead of having a hole like this where you could sew together, it had a triangle. And that triangle is very hard to sew together and heal, and a lot of men died from infection. Now the danger thing that they had was called, oops, I don't want those to fall. These right here are bearings that were put in a bag. Put about 12 of those in there. I don't have 12, but you put those in there. And if this were the end of a cannon, we'd prime it, we'd put our gunpowder in there, we'd stuff this in there with all these there, and as they would lower this down and shoot it, it would come out like buckshot, and it would spread out all over the place. And so this was a dangerous weapon that they had. And of course, as they got into close-in fighting, knives, hatchets, teeth, they would bite each other, scratch each other, do anything to stay alive and to move on. Now, at the end of our presentation, we talk about a poster contest that we have every year. Your teachers will have a copy of the rules for this poster contest. This poster contest this year has to do with people. Next year, it'll be about events. And with the poster contest, if you come in first at your school, I will take those posters from every school, and we will have a contest at our chapter. The first place will get $100, and their family and teacher will get to come to our lunch, if we have a lunch without the coronavirus. And then the second place will get $50, and then everybody else who came in first at their school who didn't come in second or first with us, well, we call them third place. And I will go around and I will give every one of those people $25. So last year, we only had a couple of schools, 3 schools that entered. And we got a lot of money that we wanted to give away to these students. And all you got to do is follow the instructions on the poster contest. This year, well, we'll send this out to the teachers. And they will have it so that they could give you a copy, and that way you can do it. Now, that concludes my presentation of the traveling trunk. We appreciate Muskogee County School District and Gentian and our lovely media specialist for filming this for us. And we hope that you have a great year, and this video helps you understand why it was very difficult to get through the 1700s, and hope that we helped you with your standards. Thank you very much.